So I've been charged with speaking about the form of the problem of evil, right? So the problem of evil generally is the problem of reconciling the existence of evil with the existence of God, all right? To get the idea behind the problem into your minds, I suggest that you entertain this thought experiment. Imagine that you could change anything at all about the world for the better. If you had power to change anything at all about the world, the way that it goes, what happens in it, what's done, you could change anything at all for the better. What would you change? If you can think of anything at all, if you don't find yourself at a loss to think of something, then you've got the idea behind the problem of evil, right? Maybe you said end world hunger, or end wars, or rape and violence, or inequality. Whatever it was, you probably came up with something. And if you did, you've got the basic idea behind the problem of evil. The thought is that God, unlike us, does in fact have the power to change anything about the world. God created the world, right? And unlike us, God knows everything about the world and what happens in it and what's going to happen. And unlike us, God is perfectly good and has the best motivations. So there shouldn't be any evil in the world if it's indeed created and governed by God. That's the basic idea, okay? How to reconcile the existence of evil with the existence of God. So this problem is generated by a certain understanding of evil and a certain understanding of God. So first of all, philosophers tend to make a distinction between two different kinds of evil, what's called natural evil and what's called moral evil, okay? Natural evil is, you could say, evil suffered, right? This is like pain, bad deprivations and privations, natural disasters, this kind of thing, all right? This is evil suffered. That's called natural evil. Moral evil, you could say, is evil done. It's not evil suffered, it's evil done, right? It's basically wickedness, okay? It's evil for which someone is morally responsible, right? That's moral evil. So if I, slap you in the face, okay, and you feel the pain, we've got two cases of evil here. We've got the moral evil of my action, right? I'm blameworthy for that. My punching you needlessly is a case of wickedness. That's moral evil. The pain that you feel as a result, the pain isn't a case of wickedness. That's not moral evil. That's natural evil. That's evil suffered, all right? So most evil done has as a result evil suffered, but the two are distinct. And it's important to distinguish them because different solutions to the problem of evil may work for one kind of evil but not for the other. So that's the understanding of evil. Now the understanding of God. Not just any notion of God generates the problem of evil. You have to understand God in a certain way. Particularly, you have to understand God in the way that theism understands God, by which I mean the God of the major Western monotheistic religions, all right? This God is taken to be the creator of the universe and to be characterized by three traditional attributes: omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence. In other words, God is all-powerful. He can do anything. God is all-knowing. He knows everything. And God is all-good. He's perfectly good. Those three attributes are then supposed to generate the problem of evil, the problem of reconciling the existence of evil with the existence of God. Okay. The logical problem of evil is one version of this problem of reconciling the existence of evil with the existence of God, all right? The logical version of the problem says that God and evil are logically incompatible, that if one exists, then the other cannot exist. And if the other exists, then the one cannot exist, all right? They are as incompatible as an immovable object and an irresistible force. You could not have in the universe both an immovable object and an irresistible force. Those two ideas are logically incompatible. If there's an irresistible force, then every object is movable. There are no immovable objects. If there's one immovable object, then there can't be a truly irresistible force, since the one immovable object could resist it, all right? Similarly, defenders of the logical problem of evil claim that God and evil are just as incompatible. If God exists, then evil cannot exist. But of course, evil does exist, therefore God must not exist. That's the logical problem of evil. Now, why suppose that if God exists, then evil can't exist? Well, it's the traditional notion of God that generates this conviction. If God is all-powerful, then he knows every way that evil could possibly come about. No, that's if he's all-knowing. All right. If God is all-knowing, then he knows every way that evil could possibly come about. If he's all-powerful, then he could prevent every evil that he knew could come about. And if he were all good, then he would want to do so. If he were perfectly good, then he would want to prevent all evil that he could. After all, if you stood idly by as some evil came about when you could prevent it, you would be morally blameworthy. So if God knew all the ways that evil could arise and had the power to prevent them all and had the good character that would motivate him to do so, then there should not be any evil. And yet there is evil. And so it looks like God, traditionally understood anyway, must not exist. As David Hume famously said, Epicurus's old questions are yet unanswered. Is he, that is God, willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then is evil? That's the logical version of the problem of evil. Now, most philosophers do not think that the logical problem of evil succeeds. Most philosophers today think that the logical problem of evil fails to prove the non-existence of God. And they think this primarily because of one solution to the problem known as the free will defense. The free will defense basically says that free will is a great good. It makes possible moral goods like courage and kindness and generosity, love, and so on. None of those things are possible without free will. And yet free will opens up the possibility of evil. If God creates free beings, then God runs the risk of there being evil in the world. What the free will defense recognizes is that divine omnipotence does not extend to doing the impossible. God can do anything possible, but God cannot do the impossible. So, for example, God can't create a married bachelor, or a square circle, or an object so heavy that he can't move it. Those things involve contradictions and therefore are in themselves impossible. It's not that God lacks the power to do them. It's not a case of something that God can't do. It's a case of something that can't possibly be done. There's no limit to divine omnipotence. That's what philosophers who defend the free will defense will say. Nevertheless, because God cannot do the impossible, it looks as if God creates free beings, then God cannot prevent evil in the world. Because the idea of a free choice that's necessarily good, a free choice that's guaranteed to be good, is impossible. If we have free will, then there is at least the possibility that we will misuse it, that we will do evil. And if every time we go to do evil which we want to do, God prevents us, then we're not truly free. That's the basic idea, that free will opens up the logical space that makes possible the coexistence of both God and evil. Because if we have free will, then God cannot prevent all of the possible evil in spite of being omnipotent, because to do so would be to undermine the free will, which would be contradictory to its existence. That's the free will defense. Most people think that the logical problem of evil is indeed solved by the free will defense. Not that it's a satisfying account of all evil, but they think that free will at least opens up the logical space within which God and evil could both coexist. You have to realize that the logical problem of evil makes an extremely strong claim. It claims that it is logically impossible, that it is a contradiction to affirm the existence of both God and evil, right? In other words, it claims that God could not possibly have a reason for permitting evil. If there's even one logically possible reason for God to permit evil, then the logical problem of evil is solved. All right. Now you'll say free will might explain moral evil, but not natural evil, right? Remember the distinction before. Well, free will in its poor exercise would give you moral evil. What about natural evil? Well, here's what free will defenders say. It's at least logically possible that natural evil, natural disasters and that kind of thing, are the result of the evil choices of some kind of supernatural beings, demons, right? Now, you might think that's not at all plausible, and you might think it's even outlandish, that it's ridiculous to suppose that tornadoes or whatever are caused by the evil choices of demons or something like that. Fine. It doesn't matter for the logical problem of evil. Because if it's at least logically possible, that is, if there's no contradiction in the claim that natural disasters are caused by the evil choices of superior beings, then the logical problem of evil is solved. It doesn't have to be true. You can even be certain that it's false, as long as the proposition is possible. As long as it doesn't involve a contradiction, then it solves the logical problem of evil, even for natural evil, right? For this reason, most philosophers don't think that the logical problem of evil succeeds. Even its most famous exponent in the 20th century said that it failed because of this free will defense, right? Instead, the discussion has shifted now from a consideration of the logical problem to what's called the evidential problem. Rather than making the very strong claim that evil makes the existence of God logically impossible, what the evidential version of the problem says is that evil makes the existence of God improbable. That it's unlikely that such a God would exist in a world with evil, and particularly what appears to be pointless suffering. The reason that this is only a probabilistic argument is because we cannot be absolutely certain that every case of evil is indeed pointless. We can't see the point, and that might make us relatively confident that there is no point. But we cannot be certain that there is no point to it, just because we can't see the point. That's why the evidential version of the problem of evil involves this weaker claim, not that evil makes the existence of God logically impossible, but that it makes God's existence improbable, that it constitutes some kind of evidence against God's existence, if not definitive evidence. So, the basic form of the evidential version of the problem of evil goes like this. There are cases of suffering in the world that an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good God could have prevented without thereby losing any greater good or permitting any equally bad or worse evil. I'll say that again. There are cases of suffering in the world that an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good God could have prevented without thereby losing any greater good or causing any evil that is equally bad or worse. But of course, if there were an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good God, then it would prevent any such evil that it could prevent without thereby losing a greater good or causing an equally bad or worse evil, right? Therefore, it seems unlikely that there is indeed such a God, right? Usually the focus is on silly cases of pointless suffering. Philosophers who are less silly will focus on real-life cases. I'm not going to go into all of the cases because we're going to get a catalog of horrors in the next presentation. Okay. But if you have ever thought that something horrible seemed pointless, if you've ever had that experience of some terrible event and you think, no good came out of it, that was totally unnecessary. There was no need for that at all. All right? Someone's gruesome and gratuitous death at a young age, someone's rape. You can name the horrors, If you ever had that experience, that there's no point to this, no need for this, then you can see the idea behind the evidential problem of evil. It seems like the kind of thing that an all-knowing, all-powerful, and all-good God would have prevented. It wasn't needed to do anything good or better or to prevent anything bad or worse. Okay? That's the evidential version of the problem of evil. Okay. I have about 5 minutes left, and in this time I want to briefly discuss a few things about both of these versions of the problem, about the problem of evil generally, all right? The first thing I want to mention about it is that the problem of evil in both forms depends on understanding good and evil as absolute and as objective. If you think that good and evil are merely subjective, relative to cultures or to personal tastes or to times or places, then you don't have the problem of evil. Why? Because what these views about good and evil would say, that they're subjective, a function of your own tastes or preferences, or that they're relative, a function of your own culture, socially constructed, or maybe even a byproduct of your evolutionary origins, that morality is simply a advantageous adaptation that helps us to be more sociable and get along better, but doesn't actually pick up on anything true about the world. If you think that about good and evil, then you don't have the problem of evil. And the reason is because if that's the way that good and evil are, that they're subjective or relative, then just because something looks bad or evil to you doesn't mean that it's bad or evil seen from God's perspective. In the same way that cultural relativism prevents you from judging and condemning other cultures, it would prevent you from judging and condemning God. You see, if good and bad are merely a matter of perspective, then perhaps what seems bad from our perspective seems good to God. Perhaps he has a special taste for suffering. You don't have it, but that would be some idiosyncrasy of your character and no grounds for condemning God. You see, all that evil would prove to you in that case is that you should be more understanding of God's position, divine culture, or something like that. Okay? So, if you think that good and evil are not objective or absolute, but merely relative and subjective, then you don't have the problem of evil. It cannot actually serve as any evidence against God. That's the first thing I want to mention. The second thing I want to mention is that the problem of evil is a characteristically modern problem. It arises in the modern period, it's first stated in the modern period, and all of the solutions are characteristically modern as well. I expect Rico to say something more about this, but no one in the ancient world, no one in the medieval world thought that evil constituted any evidence against God's existence. No one presented evil as a proof of atheism. No one, not a single person. Evil was presented as a proof of dualism. It was presented as a proof of skepticism, of Manichaeanism, all right, of Stoicism, but never as a proof of atheism. Even the quotation I gave you from David Hume, Epicurus's, right, old questions are unanswered. Epicurus believed in the gods. He was not an atheist. And the argument actually is misattributed to Epicurus. It comes from Sextus Empiricus. But in any case, Sextus Empiricus didn't use it as an argument for atheism, but as an argument for the claim that the gods must not take any interest in human affairs, that they don't exercise any kind of providence, not that they don't exist at all. So, it's a characteristically modern problem, and there are a number of reasons why it comes up. I'll mention just a few of them. Scholars have noted many of these things. One is that the Renaissance reorients our expectations toward this life. Happiness in this life becomes the standard. This life must make sense on its own terms. That's one change. Another is that the Protestant Reformation undermines the credibility of the church and of traditional understandings of evil and its relationship to God. Another is that the Enlightenment undermines belief in original sin and the terrible fallout from original sin. Before that, people expected the world to be a horrible place because they thought that it had been seriously marred by the first human beings as a result of original sin. The Enlightenment undermines belief in original sin and of its great consequences for human life. The last reason, and I think this is the most important, is that the quality of life changes dramatically from the modern period moving forward. Because of the advent of modern science and modern medicine, suffering becomes the exception in many people's lives and no longer the norm. I'm not denying that many people today still suffer a great deal, but the average person's quality of life now is much greater than it was in the Middle Ages or in the ancient world. Now that's particularly curious. Ancient and medieval people suffered much more, and yet didn't even think that that suffering would count against God's existence. But that's exactly the point. Suffering for them was the norm. It's only when suffering becomes the exception that you can wonder, why is there any of it at all? If it can be so minimized, then why not to the point of none whatsoever? And it's modern medicine especially that makes that sort of possibility more imaginable. Okay. It's too bad because I've run out of time now, and I didn't get to make my most important point. So I'll make it anyway, since Brian just gave me the go-ahead.
Don't leave us hanging.
Okay. So this is the last thing that I want to point out. The problem of evil, as I've described it, in both forms, and of all of the solutions to it, both the free will defense, but indeed all of the other solutions that have usually been offered in answer to the problem of evil, all of these versions of the problem and solutions depend on the assumption that God is a moral agent. They all depend on the idea that God's goodness is moral goodness, very much of the same kind as morally good human beings. Now, God is importantly different because his goodness is limitless and perfect, and none of us has a perfect character. But nevertheless, all of those who defend the problem of evil and all of those who offer solutions to it basically take it for granted that God is a moral agent, that God's goodness is moral goodness. That's what motivates the idea that God would want to prevent all the evil that he could, because that's what a morally upstanding individual would do. You would not stand idly by, and therefore neither should God. For me, this is the greatest problem with the problem of evil and with its solutions. And it's the reason that I don't find the problem of evil in either of its traditional forms convincing. But it's also the reason I don't find any of the solutions convincing. The reason is because I don't think that God is a moral agent, and I don't think that God's goodness is moral goodness. If you take a look at the Bible, you will not find God presented there as a morally good agent. Not at all. God is never presented as having obligations. God is never presented as having human virtues, anything along the lines that we have. God is presented as a law unto himself. He's holy, which means that he's set apart and unlike us, undefiled to be sure. And God is faithful and righteous. But that's a matter of his keeping the covenant, all the terms of which he sets himself. There's no suggestion that God is subject to any obligations outside of himself, that he is bound by any law to which he is subject, or that he owes anyone anything at all. Far from it. And if you think about God as the creator, you'll see why that would be. The creator of the universe, the origin of all things, could not possibly be subject to any obligations, could not possibly have virtues, anything like human virtues, could not possibly owe anyone anything. He is the source of all things and could not possibly owe anyone anything. So that is the most controversial claim that I've made, and I'm happy to defend it in the Q&A. But I leave you with it because probably most of you were inclined to think that God's goodness was a matter of moral goodness, that God was morally praiseworthy or something like that. And I think that's the real problem with the problem of evil, thinking that God could be badly behaved or well behaved. That, I think, is nonsense. Thank you.
Turn it off. The film clip we have just watched, all of 1 minute, is from a 1950 film by a French filmmaker, Alain Resnais. It's called Night and Fog. It's only 31 minutes long and includes wartime footage, which that was, and many scenes of post-war abandoned concentration camps. When I teach the Holocaust course, I don't use many of the films that show the horrific atrocities of the Holocaust, because you don't need to see a lot to get it. But when I show this film, and I have taught the course approximately 30 semesters, 30 times, a few days after the viewing, I ask the students which of the many scenes remains in their memories. And every single time, it is this bulldozer scene. Because bulldozers were not made to move dead bodies. The Holocaust of the Jewish people in World War II can be studied from many different angles. I often thought, where's Noel, that it would be a very profound event for a university to have a semester in which each department offered a Holocaust course, studying it from a political point of view, a sociological point of view, the psychology behind it, economics, religious, philosophical, and yes, even marketing, because propaganda was a very big deal for the Nazis. My interest in the Holocaust, spanning many years, has been concerned with the impact of the event on the faith communities of both Jewish and Christian believers. The purpose is simple. Monumental historical events often call into question previously held convictions. After such experiences, one views life through different lenses. Think of 9/11 as another historical event. We can each say, before 9/11, I thought this. After 9/11, I think this. We see things differently after these events. At the heart of the matter is one's basic understanding of humankind and of God. But this is not a theoretical quest. In fact, the key questions about the Holocaust are to be found in a slim 100-page volume called Night by Elie Wiesel. Everybody read it in middle school. And I'm here to plead with you, please read it again. Night is Wiesel's memoir of the time he spent in death camps as a very young religious boy. There are many passages we could choose, but because of time limits, I'm only going to speak about a few of them to give you an idea about how important this text is for the questions at hand. The first is found early on in the account. Elie and his father have arrived at Birkenau at the reception place for Auschwitz. They have been separated from Elie's mother and his sisters. They have escaped the first selection by the infamous Dr. Mengele. They were marching past pits of burning babies and pits of burning adult bodies. Elie couldn't believe his eyes. The prisoners were crying and praying, "May his name be blessed and magnified." Elie confesses, quote, "For the first time I felt revolt rise up in me. Why should I bless his name? The eternal Lord of the universe, the all-powerful and terrible, was silent. What had I to thank him for?" The march continued, 2 steps from the burning pit. Elie and his father were ordered to turn to the left and thus proceed to the barracks, narrowly escaping death. In a very famous passage from the text, Wiesel recounts, "Never shall I forget that night, the first night in the camp, which has turned my life into one long night, 7 times cursed and 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the little faces of the children whose bodies I saw turned into wreaths of smoke beneath a silent blue sky. Never shall I forget those flames which consumed my faith forever." There are many other passages which I hope you will take time to read, or reread as the case may be. They hold the key, actually, to probing the religious and theological meaning of the event of the Holocaust, certainly among the most important and challenging events of the 20th century. Wiesel's experience of the death camp brings him face to face with the ultimate questions. Who is God? How are we to understand God, especially in the event of meaningless suffering and death, especially the suffering and death of innocent children? Who are the people responsible for such an atrocity? How are we to understand humankind as portrayed in the images of Nazi criminals, those who assisted the final solution? And what about the silent bystanders? How are we to share the bonds which are supposed to link people to other people? Are there not ties which connect human persons to each other, which demand some minimal respect? Is there not some essential understanding of the nature of the human person, which ought to provide some basic moral norm for how we treat each other? What does it mean to be made in the image of God? How are we to understand the life we share, people with people, and human persons with God? Where are we going? Is there some goal toward which we are working? How are we to define it, and how do we get there? What is the role of the human person in reaching the goal, and what is the role of the divine in the same project? How do we incorporate an event of such incredible evil into a vision of progress and the future? Did the Nazi regime and the camps spring from the same creativity that produced Beethoven, Goethe, Kant, Bach, Gutenberg, Wagner, Albert Einstein? Can human freedom go wrong? Wiesel, as we know from his own writings and presentations, has been haunted throughout the years by these questions. Trying to be a faithful seeker, trying to reconcile his traditional belief with the reality of his experience of God and of humankind in the Nazi death camp. His journey is a haunting one with a significance only the survivor can provide. Yes, Wiesel gives us the normative questions, but he always claimed not to have the answers. For the Jewish community, the events of the Second World War were simply devastating. That is why the term Shoah, meaning devastation, is often used rather than Holocaust. Holocaust has biblical connotations of a free, sacrificial offering. From the perspective of the victims, there was no element of freedom or voluntary offering operative in the deaths of the victims. Shoah, utter devastation, is a better term. The Jewish community was stunned into silence by the events of the war. Massive portions of the European Jewish community had been lost. Wiesel wrote Night only after a self-imposed 10-year silence. The testimony of camp survivors is still being gathered. You might know that Steven Spielberg, the man who made Schindler's List, used all of the proceeds from that film to build a project called the Shoah Foundation at USC, which is the collection of as many different interviews of Holocaust survivors as he could find. They are dying off. Not all Jews, not all believing Jews, understand the Shoah as an event with religious implications. For some to do so would reveal a monstrous God, a God who was silent and inactive when the people chosen by God's design, those in covenant with God, were in most desperate need. Many others found it impossible to continue to believe at all after the Holocaust. Still others took their own lives in despair after surviving the camps, no longer able to make sense out of continuing to live. Or they experienced intense despair out of guilt for having survived when so many others did not. Still others tried to continue to believe in traditional ways. Some insist that the Holocaust changed nothing about their understanding of God or of people or of the goal of creation. The Holocaust, they say, can be incorporated into the traditional categories of the discussion of evil. But some believe that basic faith tenets need to be re-evaluated, revised in light of the Holocaust. The critical questions, of course, are how are we to think of God in a post-Holocaust world? How are we to think of humankind in a post-Holocaust world? Jewish thinking holds that history is a source of revelation about God. That's the Bible. That's the Hebrew scripture. It's about human persons and about our relationships. So for some, trying to probe the meaning of the Holocaust from this perspective is an important task. There are a number of different thinkers we could explore, but I choose only one. His name is Irving Greenberg. Irving Greenberg is still alive. He is an American, a New Yorker, born of immigrant parents in 1933. His parents were not directly involved in the Holocaust, and he never thought much about the Holocaust until later. His father was a rabbi too, and Irving Greenberg is also an ordained rabbi. In 1961, Greenberg received a Fulbright lectureship in Israel, and he and his wife spent the year there. They started reading extensively about the Holocaust and were deeply inspired by the vitality of life in Israel. Greenberg identifies the Holocaust as an orienting event, meaning a revelatory concurrence and assault on Jewish belief. One of the most quoted of Greenberg's statements is this. He calls it his working principle. No statement, theological or otherwise, should be made that would not be credible in the presence of the burning children. Greenberg understands redemption as something which occurs in stages. In each stage of redemption, the roles of the divine and the role of the human are redefined. They don't stay static. In the unfolding of covenant history, both the human and the divine are responsible for some saving actions, but the burden or the responsibility for saving actions shifts. He gives us 3 periods to think about. The first is the biblical era, during which God has a high degree of intervention. Covenant meant people kept the laws, and God protected them. There was a primitive structure of rewards and punishment. God is the senior partner in the covenant relationship. The second period is called the rabbinic era. The temple is destroyed, and there are several major military defeats in the first century of the Common Era. Major questions emerged. Had God brought an end to the original covenant? Was there no God? How could one have access to God without the temple? The rabbis concluded that the covenant was still valid, but that Israel was being called to a new level of relationship with God. God was, by self-design, more hidden now. No more overt interventions by God, and no more specific places through which believers had direct access to God. Synagogues replaced the temple. The divine is now available in many locations. And since God is speaking less, actually then humans must take the initiative to have dialogue with God, to bring their concerns to the divine. The partnership covenant is renewed, but with a shift in the roles of the divine and the human. Humans take on a more critical role, a more active role in the covenant relationship. The third era is that of the Holocaust. In the Holocaust, God is more hidden, and the catastrophe of the Holocaust is a more drastic call for Jewish responsibility for the covenant. Greenberg writes, to the question, where was God at Auschwitz? The answer is, God was there, starving, broken, humiliated, gassed, and burned alive, sharing the infinite pain as only an infinite capacity for pain can share it. What is the message of the divine presence not stopping the Holocaust, despite the most desperate pleas of his people? In effect, God was saying to humans, you stop the Holocaust. This is the beginning of the third great cycle of Jewish history, says Greenberg. This is the era of the voluntary covenant. Because of the Holocaust, Jews can and must assume even further responsibility for redemption. God is more hidden. At Auschwitz, covenantal relationship and partnership is defined anew. In place of dramatic intervention, God assumes the suffering of the human condition and the human must assume the role of the divine by taking responsibility to stop the destruction. The covenantal relationship is not over. It's brought to its full maturity by divine design. How do we do this? There's a Jewish phrase, tikkun olam, which is historically used over and over again, but Greenberg takes it again to be good for this particular time. Tikkun olam means mending the earth. Built on memory, he says, you were starving in Auschwitz, therefore feed the hungry. A new ethics emerges from the memory of the Holocaust. New days of Jewish ritual must be established. Yom HaShoah, days of Holocaust remembrance. Jewish thinkers who take the Holocaust as an event which redefines Jewish belief and practice. Greenberg is among the most important of those thinkers, I believe. I had another film, but I won't even try it for an ending. I have a little story to tell, but if you have time sometime, go to YouTube or someplace and look for Faith and Doubt at Ground Zero. It's a 2-hour documentary. You don't need to watch the whole thing unless you want to. It's a series of interviews, and mostly, it's about people who lost people at 9/11. The epilogue is the part I want to point to you. The epilogue reminds us that there were people who actually jumped from the burning buildings because they knew they couldn't get out. And the narrator is talking about 2 people who he saw who were preparing to jump, and they joined hands and jumped together. And then 2 other people come in and they give directly different interpretations of what that was all about. So I encourage you to look for the epilogue to Faith and Doubt at Ground Zero. Thank you.
So I'm gonna start off by saying, and I'm springing this on Turner for the first time right now, that in prepping for this and also thinking of the way this is all fitting together, I see a team talk course on the problem of evil maybe sometime in our future.
Sounds good to me.
So, is this on there? Or am I just whatever?
No, it
I'm
doesn't
talking.
work.
Okay, I'm loud. It doesn't matter.
I just pushed it aside because it was in my.
Yeah. Good. All right. So, I'm supposed to be, on some level, talking about solutions. But the solution is not what people expect or often what people want with this sort of thing. But what I'm going to suggest is that it's actually much more sustainable. And by that I mean logically, but also something that is fruitful instead of engaging in what I believe is the damage that is done to people through seeking answers that solve the problem of evil. And this has traditionally been known as theodicy. Theodicy in philosophical and theological circles refers to the problem of evil, but most specifically in its etymology means the justification of God. How can you justify God and why he does what he does? Or to be a proper Dionysian mystic, which I'll invoke, how it does what it does, to remove gendered pronouns. But so what I would like to suggest here, I'm going to give you my basic thesis and then the 3 main points I'm going to hit, is that it's better if we reframe this question altogether. Meaning that faith and religion and their value should be based more and measured more by what they do for personal transformation and social transformation. And what I will further suggest is that theodicy does nothing for either of those things. Now, on this point, this is an area where Sigmund Freud would say, if you're going to skirt the issue of theodicy, you have in fact made religion science proof and philosophy proof, I guess is the word. But like, you've made it science proof, you've made it philosophy proof, you've made it so that it cannot be attacked. Okay, tying back into Turner's talk, that if God is not a moral agent in the way we think of moral agents, which is also how mysticism handles this subject. In the mystical Christian tradition, the idea again and again is omnipotence. Whatever you think that means, it's beyond you. So it's not what you think that means. Whatever you think an all-good God is, whatever you have in your head, that's not what it means. Okay? Well, what Freud has to say about that, and what also David Hume and Ludwig Feuerbach have to say about that as well. If your God is so removed and undiscernible and so forth, then you might as well be an atheist. He has no discernible plan for your life. He has no... And so the way Freud puts it, you've made him science proof, you've made him proof against these critiques, but you have relinquished the interest of human beings. In other words, Freud's contention is that's what people want from religion. They want theodicy. They want an explanation of evil. They want a security blanket that tells them that things are going to be okay. I'm going to suggest that Freud is very, very wrong on this point. But don't worry, Brian, I will also come back to a positive appraisal of Freud later. And so what I'm going to do here is go through, first, how sociological understandings of theodicy and its dangers have influenced theologians to seek a different way of thinking about these things. Second, not to throw theodicy completely in the trash can, talk about what areas where it can still fulfill what I talk about as personal and social transformation. And then finally, my third point will be responding to evil rather than solving it through some sort of logical game. So, we begin with Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche's understanding of what's going on with something like theodicy or attempting to solve the problem of evil is that really what human beings seeking that are doing is implicitly recognizing they don't like the world. They don't like the world. Therefore, they need an answer that gives them a reason why they can still like the world. But for Nietzsche, even wanting that is a hatred of existence itself. Or going back to Turner's point of how it's like not necessarily a problem if you become a cultural relativist. What Nietzsche is saying is life is life. Can you learn to embrace it and love it or not? And that's a problem for Christians, Jews, atheists, anybody. Okay? And thus Nietzsche's whole philosophical project is about how one can come to be someone who embraces and loves existence. Okay? And I pretty much follow him on this point, that for me, theodicy, these types of ways of like solving the problem are really rooted in our sense of, I don't like the way the world is, therefore, this answer tells me, one, why it's okay that it is the way that it is currently, and tells me, well, it's all right that it's terrible. One day there will be something better. In this regard, then, I would say theodicy on the problem of evil is exactly what Karl Marx means by religion as the opiate of the masses. In other words, religion, when it's in its theodicy mode, is the drug you take to get by. You see all the evil, you pop the Vicodin, and you're like, okay. All right. Now, Peter Berger, one of the greatest sociologists of religion, co-author of Social Construction of Reality, he defined theodicy as the legitimation of anomic phenomena in terms of the nomos. And of course, you all understand what that means, so I'll just move along. Now, he's saying that every culture has an expectation of how the world ought to be. It creates what he calls a sacred canopy of how things ought to function. And if you follow these rules and live accordingly, things will work out the right way. But because the world is chaos at its core, in Berger's view, it's never going to work. Whatever set or system of rules we place over everything, things are always going to break through that don't make sense and that undermine whatever answers a society has come up with of how the world should be. So what is theodicy then? Theodicy is a way of stuffing that back into the suitcase, so to speak. Theodicy is a way of, as he puts it, legitimizing why those things can happen. It's a way of explaining, oh, it happened because of this, and therefore it's okay that it happened that way. Berger's most stark example that he gives is out of Eastern religious traditions when he talks about the idea of karma samsara in Hinduism. And there his whole point is, if you follow the logic of karma samsara, what you have is people that are in the realm of the untouchables, as we call them. The explanation is they are in that position because of something they did in a previous life. They deserve to be in that position, and therefore helping them is not really an imperative, or maybe even a bad thing to do. Right? It legitimizes the order of society in that way. But stepping back, Berger would say all Christian theodicies do the same thing. In other words, even just saying, well, it's God's will. God's in control of everything, so therefore it's God's will that some people are poor and some people are rich. Some people suffer horrific, pointless deaths, and some don't. Okay? That legitimizes for you, at least implicitly, but sometimes explicitly, a reason not to act, but to be content and complacent with the way the world is. Now, by the way, this is where I would say this happens in our political world as well. And this goes back to stuff Turner was talking about, that this is mainly a contemporary problem and in many ways brought about by improved quality of life throughout the, how should I put it, first world, capitalist world, whatever. And let me just give an example. When the Charlie Hebdo Paris attacks happened, as horrible as they were, 13 workers at the Charlie Hebdo thing were murdered. It was 24/7 news cycle. How could this happen? The horror. That same week, 200 people were bombed in Nigeria. And it was a blip. Buried. Why? Because the understanding is, how could this happen here in France? How could this happen in America? Nigeria, happens all the time over there. You see what I'm saying? In other words, there's a sort of privileging of an unreflective assumption that this should never happen here. But, oh yeah, it happens in Nigeria. I'm not shocked, nor am I going to be glued to my TV about it. It happens politically with things like mass shootings or terrorist attacks and so forth. And that they engage in a political theodicy. This wouldn't have happened if we'd passed this legislation. Fill in your blank, okay? And what all of that sort of thing serves to do is to not only look at certain groups of people or certain areas as, like I said, in the case of Nigeria, I would say there's an implicit racism that comes from this kind of approach to theodicy. But it also turns into like mudslingings of competing theodicies, none of which ultimately address the deeper or real issues. So contemporary theologians like Karen Kilby and Sarah Pinnock and many, many, many others have been part of a movement to say it's time for Christianity to move beyond theodicy, to move beyond this project of logically solving the problem of evil, and saying, no, evil is a problem. Full stop. And the call of the gospel is not to explain to you why evil is there, explain to you why it's or legitimize why it's okay. It's a call to action in the face of evil. And you can see this both in the book of Job. In the book of Job, Job does not engage in theodicy. His friends do. If you read the book of Job, it's his three friends all try to offer explanations about why the evil thing has happened. They're all rejected. Rejected by Job and rejected by God. Okay. Or in the Gospel of John, Jesus is asked by people wanting a theodicy, why was this man born blind? What was the reason? What caused it to happen? And Jesus says, it didn't happen for any of those reasons. Well, I'm going to heal him right now. So there's point one. Theodicy is dangerous because it legitimizes evil, and it thus in turn legitimizes complacency in the face of evil. So is there anything that can be salvaged from these sorts of things? I'll just give a couple examples. So St. Augustine quite famously argues that evil does not exist. And by that he means evil is a falling away from being, which is God, and into a progression towards non-existence. Evil is a corruption. It's like darkness is to light, or cold is to hot. They're not equal and opposing forces. Darkness and cold are the absence of heat and light. Or did I flip them? Yeah. But anyway. Now, if you use that as a theodicy, like, oh, you know what? Everything Tobie just showed us, it's okay. It's because evil doesn't really exist. Then you're going to fall into the scenario of, as you put it, or not as you put it, but was it Greenberg put it? That I don't think I'd be comfortable giving that answer in front of the suffering children, right? However, the spiritual import of what Augustine is saying there still has value, which is to say, any vice that you are suffering from, that you feel has a hold over you, at its core is something good that can be rehabilitated. Similarly, social evils, at their core, is something that can be tapped into and rehabilitated and redirected into the good. That aspect of Augustine and his idea that being is goodness and non-being is evil, I think has actual spiritual personal and social transformative possibilities. But if it's used as an answer to solve the problem, it becomes quite grotesque and problematic, especially when plugged into Greenberg's kind of test case. Similarly, Leibniz, the philosopher Leibniz, who coined the term theodicy in the first place, he went with the argument that this is the best of all possible worlds, which might be the strongest argument relating to things Turner was talking about as to well, how could this thing possibly fit? And the way I often explain Leibniz's best of all possible worlds is just imagine God is playing The Sims or some other sort of game like that, and he's ran infinite permutations of how this could all work out with free beings, and this one had to be the best one. Okay. It's logically consistent, but this goes back to Berger's point, in which the more logically worked out it is, the more it legitimates things. So for Berger, Leibniz and Karma Samsara are the two most thoroughly logically worked out theodicies, and they also potentially give you the greatest amount of complacency. Okay. Now, nevertheless, Leibniz, if we give him his stronger reading, is arguably trying to say that if we can come to view the world in a certain way, we can come to accept our role in making this part of the best of all possible worlds. Again, I think there's something that can be extracted from it for social and personal transformation, but as an answer, as a solution, as a theodicy, it's dangerous. So what do we do? Based off of what I was just saying about both Augustine and Leibniz, I move to my third and final point, responding to evil rather than solving the problem. And so I'm going to talk briefly about Paul Ricoeur, Fyodor Dostoevsky, and Francois Maurras. Now, Ricoeur, the Christian, a Protestant, French Protestant, and a big fan of Freud. And what he argues is that, similar to what I was just laying out, Christianity is not a message of theodicy. Rather, he sees it as a wisdom tradition that teaches us how to grieve and suffer loss. And he explicitly links it to Freudian psychotherapy and the stages that Freud would take someone through in grief and suffering loss. And one of the things Ricoeur has to say is, if you approach the Judeo-Christian text as a wisdom tradition on this sort of thing, as opposed to an answer, a theodicy, what you have first is read the Psalms. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to be pissed. It's actually healthy. It's actually healthy to rage and be like, God, what are you doing? Then he goes on to say, if one moves past that stage, you can come to discover that the reasons for belief have nothing to do with explaining evil, that we believe in spite of evil, or, if I may make it a little bit stronger, because of evil. And so for him, the next move is then we move beyond the complaint eventually and work to be the answer, embodiments of the answer, knowing that suffering and death are part of life, just like Nietzsche was trying to point out, and that wanting or expecting it to be otherwise is to mean that you just don't want the world to exist. And then the final thing Ricoeur says is that if you've moved through these stages, and this is where he pulls back from the way a lot of Christian thinking has done before, he says, you may find that you can convert suffering into goodness. You may find that. But Ricoeur is very adamant that you don't put that on people. You don't say, oh, God has a plan for this. Which then, because Ricoeur's point is pastorally, what that does is for anyone who's like, no, this suffering has no point, you've now redoubled their suffering with now a guilt that they haven't been able to do that. So he's saying, it's a great thing if you can come to that place, but it's also not necessary. That some things are just senseless. Which brings me to Dostoevsky. In Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, we have the famous utter destruction of theodicy by Ivan Karamazov. He takes direct aim at Leibniz and several others, but especially the best of all possible worlds idea. Such that his brother Alyosha, the novice monk that is the sweet young man who's got a very childlike faith, admits, like, yeah, I don't have any answers. In fact, admits it in the same way for the reasons that I was talking about with Peter Berger, right? His brother poses him with, if you had to make the world so that it would all come out best possible of worlds in the end, would you do that? And Alyosha has to concede no. But as Turner had pointed out earlier, that's operating with a concept of God that makes him a moral agent the same way that we are. But so Alyosha and the elder Zosima are what Dostoevsky called the response in The Brothers Karamazov. And the great literary critic Harold Bloom called it a miserable failure. But I'll suggest to you that the reason why Bloom thought it was a miserable failure is because he was looking for a theodicy. He was expecting that when Dostoevsky even told his publisher, oh, I've got an answer later. I've got a response. Actually, I like to differentiate, right? An answer is more like a solution. A response is more like, yes, but there's also this. Right? If you read the rest of the novel, what you find is that Zosima does not give teachings that are the answer. He embodies the kind of self-sacrificial love that is the answer. And what Alyosha does is the exact same thing, except he's sent out in the world to do it. And Alyosha at one point says a very key thing to his brother Ivan. He says to Ivan, you must learn to love life most of all. And Ivan's like, really? More than the meaning of life? To which he responds, you must love life most of all, certainly above logic or logical answers. And only then will you find that it has meaning. And that is just a basic human truth. The things that have meaning to you are the things that you love. And what Alyosha and Dostoevsky are saying is, love justifies itself. Love is what gives the meaning. But if you just first look at the chaos of the world and say, give me a meaning of why to love it, what Dostoevsky is willing to concede is, I can't give you one. It doesn't work that direction. You love first, and then you infuse the world with meaning, and then you become one of the key agents of combating evil. And sometimes in the smallest of ways. So I'll conclude by reading from Nobel Prize winner Francois Mauriac, devout Roman Catholic, and foreword writer to Elie Wiesel's Night. He's talking about how he was responding to his encounter with a survivor of the Holocaust that could make no sense of it whatsoever. And Mauriac says, and I, who believe that God is love, what answer could I give my young questioner, whose dark eyes still held the reflection of that angelic sadness which had appeared one day on the face of the hanged child? What did I say to this boy? Did I speak to him of that other Jew, his brother, who may have resembled him, the crucified, whose cross has conquered the world? Did I affirm that the stumbling block to his faith was the cornerstone of mine, and that the conformity between the cross and the suffering of men was in my eyes the key to that impenetrable mystery whereon the faith of his childhood had perished? Zion, however, is risen up again from the crematories and the charnel houses. The Jewish nation has been resurrected from among its thousands of dead. It is through them that it lives again. We do not know the worth of one single drop of blood, of one single tear. All is grace. If the eternal is the eternal, the last word for each one of us belongs to him. This is what I should have told this Jewish child, but I could only embrace him, weeping. And I would suggest that while Mauriac ends there with, this is what I should have told this Jewish child, I think actually that's not true. What he actually did was what his faith calls him to do. To weep with those who weep, to rejoice with those who rejoice, and to be the answer. Because to offer the theodicy that he was going to give would have been not to fulfill the example of Christ or the gospel. Thank you.
I'll start with Dr. Nevitt about philosophy. It seems to me when you talk about goodness in God and you put it in the logical way, it seems like reverse because it's like constraining God. God created everything, presumably before there was logic, so to contain God in a logical system is improper because God is beyond logic in some sense, right? So God is, in some sense, radically free. Before there was logic to constrain whatever it is. But what came through was the relationship between the divine dimension, which God created, made existence possible, but there was a human dimension in which morality comes in to, in a sense, to live in the world and bring a kind of human dimension into the world, to complete the world in that sense. So it's almost as if God created the world that was kind of incomplete because he knew, but he left it incomplete so that we could, in our own way, fulfill it to a certain degree. This is what I got from it. And I think it's really important to see that divine dimension, which like existence is possible, that's the most important thing, and then do something with existence to make it what it is. And I was always impressed by Buddha saying, finally, I guess toward the end of his life, says, samsara is nirvana. Right, because you have to live in it. Mm-hmm. Any of you could comment on it?
It's a very nice synthesis of what I had to say and what Rico had to say. I have nothing to add. Yeah. No, I think you've got it. Yeah.
And what you had to say there about the Buddha, and I actually did, both Ricoeur actually talks about how this is reframing Christian theodicy this way actually can open up dialogue, especially with Buddhism, on the question. Because in Buddhism, you definitely get a reframing of karma samsara in the way that you're talking about, right? And so, and then I've also published an article in which Hindu theologians have been trying to tackle this same problem of how to have the doctrine of karma samsara, but not let it be a theodicy that legitimates the caste system, for example. So, yeah.
Is Lance here? Did I see him? Is he
He's
here?
in
Yeah,
there.
Lance. Doesn't it connect to Jainism as well? The ideas that I was mentioning about God not being a moral agent and.
Well, Jainism is atheistic, so they don't have this particular problem. But
Well, what was it that you were telling me last summer? Because you got into this, didn't you?
well, we're gonna preview next week. Yeah,
Oh,
it's on the
okay.
agenda.
So
Don't blow his.
I'm just misremembering,
You
but
and I and Rico have kind of stumbled on
the truth.
same-
Thank God. Somebody found it.
Yeah, as you said, the problem of the evil depends not only on an understanding of evil, but on a certain understanding of God.
Yeah.
And you might say a simplistic understanding of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
But certainly the Hindu tradition might say.
Hmm. Yeah.
Is the last question?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask Rico, what was the quote? You said something at the end, it was like, don't think of evil in terms of logic, kind of like live life out. Do you know what I'm referring to?
Yes. That's Alyosha and the Brothers Karamazov. He says, you must love and love life first and foremost without any reason.
Okay.
And certainly more than logic. And then he says, and only then will you understand its meaning. And from like popular culture, one of the quotes that I often bring up in class in connection with that is Mumford and Sons' song where they say, in these bodies we will live, in these bodies we will die, but where you invest your love, there you invest your life. Right? That it's our loves that actually make the world invested with meaning. And that is the healthiest and best way to proceed with this question, as opposed to working in the opposite direction. Like, give me a reason. And again, I say, like, this is like a kind of basic human truth. Like, I'm not sitting at home, nor is any good parent going, Pablo, my 9-year-old, give me reasons to love you. Right? Like, that's not how it works. Okay? I don't love him for reasons. I love him just because. And that's what infuses our relationship with meaning. And then that's what guides me in like trying to transform myself into a better father and help him to become the young man I hope he becomes. Right? But that, for me, that is the core. That's what religion is about. And going back to, just as a quick thing, like Freud and others who thought this would relinquish the interests of men, that human beings only want the security blanket of theodicy. Sociological studies have actually somewhat argued the opposite. So like Jose Casanova, who's a secularization theorist, has pointed out that in the 20th century, all of the countries where the Catholic Church has primarily been on the side of the wealthy, the powerful, or the state, church attendance has dropped into the single digits. In countries like Poland and Brazil, where they've been on the side of solidarity movements and so forth, church attendance has actually gone up. And so in that case, religion as call to action, as opposed to security blanket, has a lot to say for it, like just with statistical evidentiary things, that maybe that's what people do really want from faith. Yeah.
Well, thank you very, very much.